The sound of drums echoing in the darkness, the smell of burnt flesh mixed with incense, and then the scream. A scream that crosses centuries and still makes us ask today, how did human beings reach this point? You are about to discover why God not only allowed, but ordered the complete destruction of an entire people. And when you know what they did with their own children, the question will no longer be, why did God destroy them? But rather, why did he wait so long? This is not just ancient history. It is the most disturbing record of how far humanity can descend when it chooses to worship what it should not. And perhaps, just perhaps, these forces are still more present than you imagine. It was 1929. French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer was excavating in a place called Ras Shamra on the coast of Syria. He had no idea what he was about to find. He had no idea he was unearthing the greatest buried secret of antiquity. When the first clay tablets emerged from the earth, covered by almost 3,000 years of oblivion, academics thought they would be just commercial records. Lists of goods, day-to-day transactions, mundane things. But they were not. They were religious texts, hymns, rituals, and as translators began to decipher that ancient cuneiform writing, a heavy silence took over the room. Because what was written there was so disturbing, so grotesque, so absolutely contrary to everything we know about humanity and compassion, that many scholars simply refused to publish the complete translations. Those tablets were from Ugarit, one of the main Canaanite cities, and they revealed in meticulous detail what really happened in the temples of Baal, Moloch, Ashtoreth, and other gods that the Canaanites worshipped with a devotion that bordered on madness. You need to understand one thing. When the Bible talks about the Canaanites and their gods, it is not exaggerating. If anything, it is being restrained. Because the complete truth is much worse than any sacred text could describe without causing absolute horror. Let us go back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 9. The flood is over. Noah and his family are the only survivors of humanity. And there, in a moment of weakness, Noah gets drunk and lies naked in his tent. Canaan, son of Ham, commits an act so shameful that the Bible does not describe it completely, but whatever happened was serious enough for Noah, upon waking and discovering it, to pronounce a prophetic curse over Canaan and all his descendants. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. These words echoed through the centuries, and the descendants of Canaan spread throughout the land. That would bear their ancestors' name, the land of Canaan, the same land that God would promise to Abraham, the same land that would become Israel, the same land that is still the scene of the most intense conflicts in the world today. But something happened to these people, something dark, something that transformed them from a simple cursed tribe into an entire civilization dedicated to practices that defy our understanding of morality. The Canaanites settled in fortified cities. They built magnificent temples. They developed trade, agriculture, art. On the outside, they were an advanced civilization, but on the inside, there was a spiritual rot so deep that it contaminated every aspect of their society. And at the center of that rot were their gods. Imagine a God who demands blood to make it rain. Imagine a God whose pleasure is in violence, in domination, in destruction. That was Baal. Baal was not just a god, he was the god of the Canaanites, the lord of the storm, the controller of fertility, the owner of life and death, and he was insatiable. The texts of Ugarit describe Baal as a brutal warrior. His stories are filled with graphic violence. In one of the myths, Baal kills his enemies and literally bathes in their blood. In another, he devours his adversaries. The descriptions are so violent that they seem like pages torn from a modern horror movie. But here is what really matters. The Canaanites did not just read these stories, they imitated them. The rituals of Baal involved religious orgies in the temples, sacred prostitution, men and women engaging in extreme sexual practices because they believed this would stimulate Baal to make the land produce. They believed that by imitating the union of Baal with the goddess Ashtoreth, they would be guaranteeing rains and harvests. But this was just the beginning, because Baal also demanded death, blood, and not just any blood. He wanted the blood of what was most precious, children. Parents took their children to the altars of Baal, and there, before priests who danced in a trance, to the sound of deafening drums that muffled the screams, to the smell of incense that masked the odor of burnt flesh. There, these parents delivered their own children to be sacrificed. Why? For fertility, for wealth, for protection, for fear that if they did not do this, Baal would punish them with drought, famine, and destruction. The prophet Elijah confronted 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And when we read this story, sometimes we see it as an abstract theological dispute. But it was not. It was a direct confrontation against a religious system that was literally consuming children in its flames. If Baal was terrible, Moloch was horror personified. Imagine a gigantic bronze statue, a bull with a human head, or depending on the region, a human figure with a bull's head. Its arms extended forward, forming an inclined platform. And inside that statue, fire. A lot of fire. This was Moloch. Archaeological discoveries in Carthage, an ancient Phoenician colony, the Phoenicians were coastal Canaanites, revealed something that made even the most experienced researchers recoil in shock. An entire field of urns containing cremated remains of babies and small children, thousands of them. At first, some academics tried to argue that they were just cemeteries of children who died naturally. But the analysis of the bones did not lie. Those children were burned alive, and the inscriptions on the urns were dedications to Moloch, thanking the god for blessings received in exchange for the sacrifice. The rituals of Moloch were calculatedly cruel. The statue was heated until it was glowing. Drums played frantically. Priests danced and shouted mantras. And then, the parents handed their babies to the outstretched arms of the statue. The child rolled down the inclined arms and fell directly into the flames inside the bronze belly of the statue. The screams were muffled by the drums. The parents were taught to remain impassive without showing sadness or regret, because any sign of weakness could invalidate the sacrifice. Leviticus 18:21 says, "You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." Deuteronomy 12:31 is even more direct. "You shall not do so to the Lord your God, for every abomination to the Lord which he hates they have done to their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods." God was not being dramatic. He was being literal. If the male Canaanite gods demanded violence and blood, the goddesses demanded something equally destructive, the complete perversion of human sexuality. Ashtoreth, also called Ishtar or Astarte, depending on the region, was the goddess of fertility, love, and war. A strange combination. Not for the Canaanites, because for them, sex was power. Sex was control. Sex was religion. The temples of Ashtoreth were sacred brothels. Cult prostitutes, both women and men, were available for anyone who wanted to worship the goddess. And this worship consisted of sexual acts performed inside the temple as an offering to the divinity. But it was not just prostitution, it was the sacralization of abuse. Young girls were dedicated to Ashtoreth and forced to serve sexually in the temples. Men castrated themselves in frenzied rituals of devotion. Mass orgies took place during festivals, where any moral or ethical limit was completely dissolved in the name of worship. Asherah, another Canaanite goddess frequently mentioned in the Bible, was represented by wooden poles carved with phallic and vaginal symbols. These poles were planted in high places, hills and mountains, where the Israelites repeatedly allowed themselves to be seduced by Canaanite worship. The Bible mentions numerous times how the kings of Israel and Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord by allowing or participating in the worship of Asherah. King Josiah, during his religious reform, destroyed the objects of Ashtoreth and Asherah, burned the bones of the priests of these cults on the altars themselves, and completely desecrated the places of worship. Why so much violence against these symbols? Because behind them was an entire structure of abuse, exploitation, and destruction of everything that God had created as good and pure. Here is what many do not understand. When God ordered Joshua to completely destroy the Canaanites when entering the Promised Land, it was not arbitrary genocide. It was spiritual surgery. God knew something that would take centuries for humanity to understand. Ideas are more contagious than viruses, and Canaanite ideas were especially virulent. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them, because they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Deuteronomy 7:2-4. But Israel disobeyed. They made alliances. They married Canaanites, and inevitably they were seduced by the gods of Canaan. The book of Judges records the painful cycle. Israel worships other gods. God allows them to be oppressed. Israel cries out for help. God raises up a deliverer. There is peace for a time, and then Israel returns to worshipping other gods. In the time of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth had become official in Israel. Temples were built, priests were appointed, and Israelite children began to be thrown into the flames of Moloch. The prophet Jeremiah, centuries later, still found this practice happening. They built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Moloch, which I did not command them, nor did it come into my mind that they should do this abomination. Jeremiah 32:35. God is saying that this was so absurd, so contrary to his nature, that it did not even cross his mind that human beings could do such a thing. But they did, and they continued doing it, generation after generation, until God finally allowed Babylon to destroy Jerusalem and take the people captive. Now you understand. Now you know why God not only allowed, but ordered the destruction of the Canaanites. It was not cruelty, it was mercy. Mercy for the children who would no longer be burned alive. Mercy for the girls who would no longer be sexually enslaved. Mercy for the young people who would no longer be corrupted by a religion that transformed the lowest instincts of humanity into divine commandments. And yes, it was also protection. Protection for Israel, because God knew that if that influence remained, it would eventually consume his people as well. Modern archaeology has confirmed something frightening. The Canaanites were not exaggerated by the Bible. If anything, the reality was worse than the sacred text describes. The fields of urns with sacrificed babies, the texts detailing violent sexual rituals, the artistic representations of extreme violence in the cults, everything was there, buried, waiting to testify that God was right. But here is the question you need to ask now. Have these spirits really disappeared? Because when you look at the world today, when you see sexual exploitation being normalized, when you see violence being glorified as entertainment, when you see children being sacrificed on the altar of personal comfort through abortion, have the gods of Canaan really died? Or have they just changed their names? The story of the Canaanites is not just a lesson in ancient history. It is a prophetic warning. It is the record of what happens when a society decides that there is no absolute right or wrong, that each person can define their own morality, that personal pleasure is worth more than moral responsibility, that children are disposable when inconvenient. The Canaanites began by normalizing sexual immorality. Then they sacralized it. Then they moved on to child sacrifice as the maximum expression of devotion to their gods. And us, where are we in this progression? The Bible says in 1 Corinthians 10:11, "Now these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." The Canaanites were destroyed. But before they were destroyed physically, they were destroyed morally. Before they lost their cities, they lost their souls. Before they fell before the armies of Joshua, they fell before the altars of Baal. And the warning remains: societies that sacrifice their children, literally or figuratively, on the altar of false gods, do not last. So tell me, after knowing the truth about the Canaanites and their horrible gods, after understanding why God ordered their destruction, do you still think God was unjust? Or do you now understand that his justice was, in fact, the only possible answer to such absolute evil? Write in the comments, do you believe that these spirits still operate in the world today? And if you believe, what are you doing to not fall into the same trap that destroyed an entire civilization? If this video impacted you, subscribe to the channel, but only subscribe if you really want to know truths that most prefer to ignore, because here we do not hide what is uncomfortable. Here we reveal what needs to be said.